The topic for the seminar this weekend is the roots of secular humanistic Judaism. And so it's worth taking a few moments to talk about what it means when we say roots. We don't simply mean biological roots, as in the ethnic history of the Jewish people. That would be a different seminar. Rather, what we're talking about are intellectual roots. So this is a kind of intellectual history class, seeing where ideas start, how they develop, how later generations understand them, reinterpret them, and develop them in new directions. And sometimes it's useful to think about our intellectual roots with an analogy to human evolution. After all, as living beings, as human beings, we have many roots biologically. We can go back to the single-celled organisms that are the beginning of all life. On some level, that is one of our roots, but a very, very distant root. Or you can think about the mammals alive during the period of the dinosaurs. Again, an ancestor of ours, but very, very distant and very different from us. Or you can think about a saber-toothed tiger, or one of those early large mammals, or even an Australopithecus, the first branch off from the simian tree, so to speak. Or someone closer to us, like a Homo habilis, a tool-making member of the genus Homo, who nevertheless still has substantial differences from the modern Homo sapiens. So each of those layers becomes more and more similar to us the closer it gets to our generation. We begin to see more and more features in common the closer it is to us, but there's still going to be significant differences. So, for example, last time we talked about traditional Jewish wisdom learning sources. That's going to be a somewhat more distant root for us than something like Reform Judaism or Yiddish socialism, which are closer in time but also closer in form to who we are. And we also understand, of course, from biological evolution that the same root can branch into different directions. So that Jewish traditional wisdom that we see as one of our roots also is a root for Orthodox Judaism or ultra-Orthodox Judaism or Reform Judaism, because that same source can be drawn on in different ways. So just because we claim something as a root doesn't mean necessarily that we are the exclusive claimants of that as our predecessor, because other branches also can have a legitimate claim to that background. So I try to divide the layers of antecedents, or things that came before us, into three stages. One is a precursor. A precursor is something that came before us with many similarities, but may not have had a lasting connection. It might have been an episode that sounds very familiar, but didn't produce a school of thought, didn't lead to a sort of organic transmission over time. One example we'll be looking at today is the episode of Hellenistic Judaism, which during the last couple centuries BCE and the first couple centuries of the Common Era was a very prominent part of Jewish life. It was a synthesis between Greek culture and thought and Jewish culture and thought. But in the end, it didn't lead to a lasting tradition that was organically transmitted through the centuries that ultimately became humanistic Judaism. There's no line of transmission in that way. Another example like that, which we'll look at today, is Baruch Spinoza, who is an important precursor to secular and humanistic Judaism, but he didn't create a school of Spinoza thought. There was no group of Spinozan Jews that then passed on his teachings. It was an episode. It had an impact in the broader European culture who read him in Latin, which is what he wrote in, but it didn't have a direct impact on Jewish culture for many centuries until later generations turned back to him and started to read him. And we also understand, of course, that these precursors are responding to a very different environment. Just like in biology, a different environment will result in different expressions of an identity and different levels of success, depending on how the environment changes. So one level is a precursor, like us, but not necessarily connected directly. The second is an ancestor. Now, an ancestor has some kind of a, quote, genetic or mimetic cultural connection through the centuries. It may be very far in the past, but there is a line of transmission. So there's some kind of direct connection from generation to generation. And then the third layer, closest to us, I would call really a legitimate root. Someone who has a direct descent with clear similarities and a continued influence even in our own day. So not simply something that was surpassed and left behind, but someone who continues to inspire. And in theory, this is the more tendentious part, in theory, someone who you could claim as a direct root if they were somehow magically transported in time, or science fictionally transported in time to our own day, and they witnessed the secular humanistic Jewish community, they might say, okay, that makes sense to me. I see some identification with that. Now, that's a very, you can't play that out automatically. They might have looked at us and said, what are you doing? And what are these flying machines up in the air? But the reality is that there are times where you can find people whose style of thought, whose approach would be so much in concert with one's own that you can imagine if you had a dinner together, you'd have a lot to talk about. So again, those three levels of precursor, which is an episode that may not have a direct connection, an ancestor from the distant past sometimes, but having some kind of chain of transmission, and a direct root, which is often much closer in time, but also a direct descent connection. And ultimately, the goal of the seminar is to help to refine our understanding of who we are by understanding how we came to be, so that origin story has a lot to say about who we are today. So the first example I want to look at is that issue of Hellenistic Judaism. Beginning in, as I said, in the 2nd century BCE, there was a long and active interaction between Greek culture and Jewish culture. If you know anything about the Maccabees in Hanukkah, you'll know that the Maccabees themselves were fighting as much a civil war as it was a war against the Greeks. In fact, the first person killed in the Maccabean rebellion, if you read the books of Maccabees, was a Jew. It was a Jew who was sacrificing on a Greek idol, on a Greek altar, rather. And so he was killed, as was the Greek religious officiant who was there as well, but the Jew was the first person killed. And it describes in the book of Maccabees how there were many Jews who were attracted to Greek culture. They wore Greek clothes. They learned Greek language. They participated in Greek naked gymnasium athletics. And that was one of the places where their difference as Jews was clearly marked, because the Greeks had an abhorrence of any kind of bodily modification. They hated tattoos. They hated cutting off things that worked just fine. And so in particular, circumcision was a dividing line for Greeks and Jews. So much so that some Jews began to try to hide their circumcision during this Hellenistic period. And it's likely that the Jewish version of the surgery that takes place today is more radical than it used to be. It used to be more of a sort of ceremonial, just clip off the end. Now it's a total removal, and that has most likely been one of the legacies of this Hellenistic period, where the religious authorities among the Jews said, we're going to make this impossible to hide or reverse, or practically impossible to hide or reverse, and we are going to make that line between the two communities that much more bold and bright. But there were Jews who were attracted to Greek culture, even short of that circumcision issue. They saw a lot of advantages to Greek culture. It was a global culture at the time, across the Mediterranean. It was interested in philosophy and reason and ideas, not simply relying on ancient tradition. It was successful economically. The Greek marketplace was a staple of architecture, whereas the old style of Jewish economy, which was primarily farming and shepherding, simply couldn't compete with the Greek mercantile economy. And so in those last couple centuries before the Common Era, one of the greatest Jewish centers in the world was not in the land of Israel. It was in a place called Alexandria, which is in Egypt, named after Alexander the Great, actually, who founded it. He also founded a city named after his horse, Bucephalus, for some reason, but that was less important to Jewish history. Alexandria, however, was crucially important. It became the home of tens of thousands of Jews. At one time, the city of Alexandria was 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Greek, and 1/3 native Egyptian. It was like the New York of its day. The library of Alexandria, the commercial centers of Alexandria, the monumental architecture. And if you had the choice of living in Nowheresville in the hill country of Judea, or Alexandria, the great and bright city, you would go to Alexandria. This is one of those pieces where Jewish history is more complicated than the sort of comic book version of it may have been taught in Sunday school, at least not in our Sunday school, but in other Sunday schools. The idea that the Jews lived in the land of Israel forever, and then when the Romans destroyed them, they were all expelled, and it was terrible. About 2/3 of the Jewish people lived outside of the land of Israel before the temple was destroyed. 1/3 lived in Babylon, where they had stayed since the Babylonian exile, and 1/3 had chosen to move to Alexandria for all the attractions provided by Greek culture. So often, Greek culture, Hellenistic Judaism, is sort of derided as the antithesis of Judaism. You hear about Athens and Jerusalem as opposite poles of living. But for a lot of people, having a foot in both worlds felt attractive. So, for example, the Greek Jewish community in Alexandria was the first to translate the Bible. They took the Bible out of Hebrew and put it into Greek. Now, they wrote a story that claims it was sort of a miraculous process where there were 70 scholars locked up in 70 different rooms, and somehow they all produced exactly the same translation. The claim is that only a divine circumstance could have allowed that to happen, therefore this is an authorized translation. The reality of the fact is most likely the Hebrew schools in Alexandria weren't very good. And people couldn't understand the text if they were only read it in Hebrew. And so there was a need to provide a translation because Jews had become so assimilated to Greek culture that they needed it in Greek to understand it, just like we are today. In an English setting, if we had to only read the Bible in Hebrew, there'd be much less comprehension than if we're able to read it in English. And there were other examples of this synthetic culture. So one example that I'll mention that's in your packet is a leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria around the year 0. His name was Philo. Philo is the progenitor of a school of Jewish work that's often referred to as Jewish philosophy. And defining that term gets a little bit tricky because does that mean any philosophy done by a Jewish person? Is that Jewish philosophy? That begins to be kind of a Nazi definition of it, essentialist. Whereas for most people, Jewish philosophy is approaching Jewish ideas from a philosophic perspective. You may have heard of a department in many universities called philosophy of religion. And what they're doing basically is trying to apply philosophic categories, explanation, and style to religious questions. Why bad things happen to good people, or can you have faith there's a God? And they're exploring those things using philosophy. That's what Jewish philosophy is doing based on the model that Philo of Alexandria presented. He was identified with the Jewish community, he represented them to the Roman Empire in some disputes, but he was very deeply exposed to Greek philosophy. One of the ironies is that a lot of Hellenistic Jewish culture that we have today was not preserved by Jews. It was preserved by the Christian church. They're the ones that preserved the Greek translation of the Bible. It's called the Septuagint. And by the way, the term Septuagint comes from sept, 7, like those 70 scholars in the rooms. And sometimes in academic notation it's listed as LXX, which is the Roman numerals for 7. So the Septuagint was preserved by the Christian church. It became the basis for the Old Testament. The book of Maccabees was preserved by the Catholic Church, not by the Jews. And Philo was preserved by Christianity and not by the Jews. Nevertheless, he very clearly is trying to defend the honor of Judaism using the canons of philosophy. So we'll take a look at a couple examples of his writing here, just to give you the flavor. This is on page 3 of your packets if you have it. Otherwise, you can look on or just listen as we go through it. Of other lawgivers, some have set forth what they consider to be just and reasonable in a naked and unadorned manner, while others, investing their ideas with an abundance of amplification, have sought to bewilder the people by burying the truth under a heap of fabulous inventions. But Moses, rejecting both of these methods, the one as inconsiderate, careless, and unphilosophical, the other as mendacious and full of trickery, made the beginning of his laws entirely beautiful, and in all respects admirable, neither at once declaring what ought to be done, or the contrary, nor, since it was necessary to mold beforehand the dispositions of those who were to use his laws, inventing fables himself, or adopting those which had been invented by others. So you hear Moses here described as avoiding what is unphilosophical. The trope in Greek literature of the lawgiver, the Solon of Athens, the lawgiver is a prominent figure in Greek philosophical writing, and clearly he's presenting Moses as the preeminent lawgiver, as the preeminent philosopher. And so we'll jump down now to the beginning Roman numeral 2, the bottom half of the page. Some men, admiring the world itself rather than the creator of the world, have represented it as existing without any maker and eternal. Who is that? That's Aristotle. Aristotle presents the word as eternal, always existing. There might have been a prime mover, the first cause that starts everything, but the world in its material sense always existed. But in Jewish philosophy and in Jewish thought generally, there's a strong belief in what they call creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. There was nothing, and then God said, let there be, and things appeared. You have to start from that point. In fact, in rabbinic midrash, they say, why was the world created with a bet? Why use the letter bet at the beginning of the Bible for Bereshit? Why not start with an aleph? It's the first letter. And the answer, one of the answers that's given is because the bet sort of faces this way. And in Hebrew you read this way, and they say, so you can't look before. And you can't look above, and you can't look, don't ask who made God. Don't ask what was before. There's only so far you can go, and then you have to start from that point. So Philo here is trying to defend the validity, philosophically, of believing in a creation from nothing. And he's rejecting Aristotle's perspective of the world being eternal. And as impiously and falsely have represented God as existing in a state of complete inactivity, that's a God that doesn't intervene in the world, kind of deist, creator, prime mover God who doesn't intervene. Again, Philo is saying that's not appropriate. It would have been right, on the other hand, to marvel at the might of God as the creator and father of all. And the next paragraph. But Moses, who had early reached the very summits of philosophy, so Moses is the best philosopher, not the best revelation ever, it's the best philosophy ever, and who had learned from the oracles of God the most numerous and important principles of nature. So God is like the university professor, not revealing cosmic truths. It's the truths of the principles of nature, which, of course, you could learn through long and exhaustive study, as philosophers have done, or you can get the shortcut. And the shortcut is using Moses' textbook. Was well aware it is indispensable in all existing things there must be an active cause and a passive subject. Yes?
Before you go on, can you tell us how many years between this, whatever his name is, and when the Bible, quote unquote, was finally compiled? Because I'm kind of surprised that he believed in Moses to begin with. So
well, the Torah is put together around 500 BCE.
Okay.
And it's universally understood by Jews and non-Jews as having been written by Moses. It's called the Five Books of Moses many times in other parts of the Bible. The Hebrew Bible itself is not compiled, and I mean the final canonization takes place actually after Philo, around 90 of the Common Era. But most of the books are done before then. So, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, which is contemporaneous to Philo, has copies of every book of the Bible that we have in our own modern Hebrew Bible, except for the book of Esther. They didn't include it because it doesn't have God's name, and because it takes place outside of the land of Israel, and there's an intermarriage, and there's all kinds of reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls community didn't like Esther. But otherwise, they have every book that we know of today. So most of the Bible was done by the time Philo was writing. Certainly the Septuagint translation was done by the time Philo was writing. But we have to remember, we can't project back our values on the previous centuries. This is 2,000 years ago. No one in Philo's day is saying, I don't think Moses wrote this. That's simply not an option. So you can't expect to find, a Bertrand Russell or a Sherwin White 2,000 years ago. It's a function of context. But where Philo is interesting to us is in this attempt to try to use reason and logic to harmonize his Jewish inheritance with what he understands to be true about the world, and to try to explain being Jewish in ways that reflect philosophy. So I'll give you one more example on the next page. This is the beginning of section 3. Moses says that the world was made in 6 days. Not because the Creator stood in need of a length of time. You think he really thinks God 6 days to do things? Of course not. For it is natural that God should do everything at once, not merely by utting a command, but even thinking of it. Why did he have to say, let there be? He didn't have to say anything. He just says, done. Could all happen like that. But instead, because the things created required arrangement, and number is similar to arrangement. And of all numbers, 6 is, by the laws of nature, the most productive. You bet you didn't know that 6 was the best number. For of all the numbers, from the unit upwards, it is the first perfect number, being made equal to its parts and made complete by them. The number 3 is half of it. The number 2 is a third of it, and the unit is a sixth of it. And so to say, it is formed of being both male and female, odd and even. It is made of the power of both natures. The odd is the male, the even is the female. The first of the odd numbers is 3, and the first of the even numbers is 2, and the 2 multiplied together is 6. It is fitting, therefore.
I agree that male and odd
Okay. It is fitting, therefore, that the world, being the most perfect of created things, should be made according to the perfect number, namely 6. Keep in mind also, he points out later, that the number 6 is the first and only number that is both the sum and the product of its parts. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. Wow. Now, this is a great example of the difference between logic and reason. This shows signs of logic, right? But it does not seem reasonable at all. This isn't proving why 6 days for the creation of the world, that the world was created in 6 days. So what he's trying to do is to make the revealed truth that he believes in plausible, but again, it may not be provable from our sense of natural philosophy. The thing to keep in mind as well is that Aristotle also was not a purveyor of rational empirical science. For example, Aristotle believed that the natural state of objects was to be at rest, and they always want to stop. So when I push this, it stops because it wants to be at rest. He didn't do experiments that later generations would do to discover what friction is, and to extrapolate the possibility that if there were no friction, and I pushed that clip, it would just keep going. That takes empirical science as opposed to just observable. Or another version, Aristotle at one time wrote that you have a little light in your eyes. And when you close your eyelids, the light goes out. And when you open your eyelids, the light goes on. And that's how you can see. It works, right? Close your eyes. It's dark, and you open it, and it's light again. Again, it makes logical sense, like there's some order of thinking you can see there. But when you take it in a more empirical, experimental sense, you can find ways to prove that that's not true. So this is the balance between philosophy as a pure philosophy and what we would understand as philosophy informed by rational science. Now, the other thing we have to remember is that Philo was not universally accepted. As I mentioned, he wasn't preserved in Jewish literature. He wasn't preserved in the Bible, wasn't preserved in rabbinic thought. And many of the rabbis who became the arbiters of what counted as Jewish rejected this Greek version of Jewish identity. In fact, they came up with an epithet, an accusation they would throw at anybody who they felt was heretical in the Greek direction. And the epithet they would use in Hebrew or in Yiddish for that matter is apikorsut. Epicurus is the heretic, the one who knows better, but doesn't observe. In fact, in rabbinic law, there were 2 categories of people who didn't observe rabbinic law, who were Jewish. One was the Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz means person of the land, the peasant. They didn't observe the law because they were too dumb. They were too ignorant, they just didn't know the law. But the Epicurus, in some way, is worse. The Epicurus knows better and still disobeys. Now, those who have any training in philosophy might recognize that word Epicurus is sounding like a Greek philosopher whose name was Epicurus. And if you read Epicurus, you'll find a lot that sounds very familiar. Epicurus believed that when we die, we're dead. And the atoms of our body disperse, and we are no more. And so he said there's no reason to fear death, because before I was born, I was not, and after I'm dead, I will not be, and there's nothing to be worried about. It will be just nothing. He also believed the gods, and he said he believed in gods, had nothing to do whatsoever with human beings. Because why would a god make his or her happiness contingent on human beings obeying him? That's crazy. We're very bad servants in that respect. The only way to ensure God's happiness was to make sure they had nothing to do whatsoever with human beings. So the gods are totally indifferent to what happens to people, so don't worry about what the gods say. Again, things that have a sort of what I call a humanistic or humanist direction as a kind of evolutionary ancestor. So it's interesting that the rabbis chose Epicurus as the basis for their epithet they would throw at people by calling them an apikorsut or a heretic. So on the bottom of this page, page 5 of the packet, you have a couple examples of rabbinic texts that talk about the apikorsut. And from Mishnah Sanhedrin, all Israel has a portion in the world to come. As it is said, the people will be righteous, and so on. And these are they that have no share in the world to come. He that says there is no resurrection of the dead laid down in the Torah. He that says the law, the Torah, is not from heaven. And an apikorsut, and the heretic. And later commentators go on to explain what they mean by each of these categories. They try to prove that the resurrection of the dead, rabbinic belief, is in fact in the Torah. I will tell you, spoiler alert, it isn't in the Torah, but they try to find texts that hint that it might be. By the way, this is also a good proof text to bring to people who say, oh, Jews don't believe in an afterlife. In one of the core rabbinic texts it says, resurrection of the dead, as something that you have to believe in, otherwise you have no share in the world to come. Oh, that sounds like an afterlife too. Also it says the Torah, the law is not from heaven. Again, we don't agree with that either. And finally, the apikorsut, the heretic who rejects rabbinic law. I've often thought, by the way, that humanistic Jewish communities, if they organize choirs, should call them the apikorsut. I noticed a commentary to this same section in the Talmud, which comes from a later generation. Rabbi Eliezer said, be diligent to learn the Torah and know how to answer an apikorsut. Rabbi Yochanan commented, they taught this only with respect to a Gentile apikorsut. With a Jewish apikorsut, it would only make his heresy more pronounced. In other words, don't even bother arguing, because you're never going to convince him, you're only going to make him more strongly rejecting rabbinic law. So there was one character in rabbinic literature who is often pointed to as the preeminent or paradigmatic apikorsut. It's a man named Elisha ben Avuya. He was trained as a rabbi. In fact, some of his teachings as a rabbi are preserved in rabbinic literature, but at some point he went astray. And in later stories about him, they often refer to him as Acher. Acher means the other, that one. They don't even want to use his name because he's so far rejected. By the way, if you want a very interesting sort of historical fiction rendering of his life, there's a wonderful novel called As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. It's a very good read and really sort of puts you in the setting of late Second Temple Judaism, around the time Acher would have lived, and it presents his view very sympathetically through most of the book. Might be a good book club discussion or something like that. As a Driven Leaf is a very good one. It dramatizes his story based on the few fragments we have of his life as represented in rabbinic literature. So here are some examples of what they said about Acher. It is said of Acher, when he entered a meeting place for scholars and saw youngsters with scrolls in front of them, he would say, why do they sit here and occupy themselves thus? This one's craft should be of a builder. That one's a carpenter. That one's a painter. In other words, get a real job. Why are you being a rabbi? Get a real job. And when the youngsters heard the talk, they left their scrolls and went away. It is also said of Acher that Greek song did not cease from his mouth. And whenever he rose to leave the house of study, heretical books would fall out of his lap. He was the classic reading the book inside the book. Then he was revealed when it fell out of his lap when he stood up. And then they began to ask, what made him go astray? Of course, reading heretical books didn't help. Of course, questioning the rabbinic endeavor didn't help. Some say he became a heretic when he saw a pig dragging along in its mouth Rabbi Chutzpitz, the interpreter's tongue, and he said, from the tongue from which pearls of purest gray used to come is to lick the dust. It's a question of justice. Here was an interpreter who was serving God and tradition, and he died, and a pig gets to eat him? I mean, how is that fair? And then he gives another example here. What did he see that made him go wrong? It is said that once, while sitting and studying in the valley, he saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on the Sabbath, take the mother bird with the young, and descend in safety. So he broke the Sabbath and violated a Torah law that says when you want to take eggs, shoo the mother away, take the eggs, and then go down. At the end of the Sabbath, he saw another man climb to the top of the same palm tree, and a snake bit him, and he died. And Elisha exclaimed, it is written, let the mother go and take only the young. Do you fare well and live a long life? Where is the well-being of this man? And where is the prolonging of his life? And it also mentions the story of Rabbi Judah the baker in the same way. And he said, since that is so, there is no reward for the righteous, and no resurrection of the dead. Another version of this saying is, leit din velet dayan, in Aramaic, there is no judge and there is no justice. It's a rejection of what you're supposed to believe in piety. He knows rabbinic law. In fact, there's another saying, episode, where one of his students comes out to meet him. He's riding a horse on a Yom Kippur on the Sabbath. So he's like breaking everything possible. And they're walking together as Elisha the heretic is talking to his former student about what he's been studying and teaching his students. And then they get to a certain point, and Elisha says, Meir, go back. Meir says, why? And Elisha says, we've reached the farthest you can walk on a Shabbat before you violate the boundaries. And Meir says, how do you know? Elisha says, I was counting my horse's steps, and I was keeping track for you, not for me. And so it's a great example of someone who knows the law, but who rejects the law, and who's been exposed to Greek philosophy and lifestyle, but still has some attachment to being Jewish, perhaps even if only in an oppositional way. I mentioned last night the phenomenon of the avsalachas, the person who tries to get you mad just on purpose, who eats the ham sandwich on Yom Kippur in front of the synagogue, just to show off. And to some extent, that's where the Epicurus led. But it also became the epithet for someone who asked the question beyond the boundary. My father remembers growing up in Brooklyn in the 1940s, when he was attending his yeshiva school after public school, that if he asked a question that was beyond the bounds of what you could ask, it was apikorsut. You were too far. So as much as Jewish culture has this legend tradition of being open to question everything and discuss everything, there were some questions, if you asked them, you went too far, and you would be expelled from the house of study. I saw a hand for a question or comment.
Yes. Well, I just wondered with some of those examples, was the idea that the man who climbed the tree and violated the laws, that what should have happened was he was struck.
He should have been bitten by the snake.
That immediately, there's no concept that he'll get his. Don't worry, he'll get his later on. He's going to suffer.
Well, in this case, it was sort of a stark demonstration. He did it and got away, and the other person followed the rules and died instantly. So even if the other guy's going to get it later, the one who did follow the rules shouldn't have died right away. And we have to remember that this period between the Maccabees and the destruction of the temple was a period of tremendous persecution of the Jews. There was a lot of Jewish suffering going on, and a lot of it was based on observing the laws. So in the Maccabean persecution, the people who circumcised their children were killed. The people who studied the Torah were burned. And so they had to come up with an answer, because the Torah says, study me and live, follow the laws and live. That's when most likely this concept of an afterlife, a resurrection of the dead, a world to come, enters into Jewish thought, because it's trying to solve the problem of why are these people suffering? Where is their reward? And the answer is, if it's not here, then maybe it's post-dated. I sometimes call this a wimpy theology. Not because it's weak, but it's like Wimpy and Popeye. I'll pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. You'll suffer now, but at some point in the future, you will get your reward. It's sort of a promise after your death. Okay. But there were Jews who didn't believe it. There were these Hellenistic Jews who were exposed to Greek philosophy, Greek literature. Some of them maintained a pious Jewish identity, and some of them may have gone off into a much more philosophical and rejecting Jewish theology direction. Okay. Any questions on Philo, Hellenistic Judaism, the Epicurus? Yes?
Go ahead.
I read that book. Someone gave me that book about 13, 14 years ago, and it's fascinating, but is it basically true?
No. I mean, any historical fiction written in the 1950s about the 50s is going to have a lot of invention to it. What he did was he drew on the rabbinic sources that are available. But of course, we have to remember these are the rabbis writing about someone they didn't like. You wouldn't expect to learn about the Democratic Party by reading the Republican Party's website.
Milton Steinberg also ostracized?
Well, Milton Steinberg himself was a conservative rabbi by training, but had become a Reconstructionist. He was active in Mordechai Kaplan's work. And in general, in the conservative movement in the 30s and 40s, the Reconstructionists were sort of looked down on or made fun of. In fact, when Mordechai Kaplan wrote his new Haggadah, it was condemned in a letter to the faculty by the chancellor of the university. He was, in some cases, persona non grata when it came to the conservative movement. So he was somewhat on the outs, but he wasn't rejected in the same way that Mordechai Kaplan was, and he actually died surprisingly young. So he didn't have time to develop a radical reputation. But clearly he's writing this book with sympathy for a villain out of the rabbinic tradition, so there's something that puts him a little out of the mainstream. Yes?
I've read a little bit about Philo, and they talk a lot about him being a Neoplatonist.
Yes.
And that that had a lot to do with his conception of trying to reconcile the Jewish theology of his time with Greek philosophy.
Yes, that's right. And that's why, for example, he rejects Aristotle, because Plato and Aristotle are often seen as opposing poles on the natural world versus any kind of supernatural realm. Often Platonic thought or Plato-based thought was easier to reconcile with the supernatural than Aristotelian thought. But over the centuries, this would reemerge in the Arabic world, for example, when they created Arabic translations of Aristotle and Plato, which ironically would preserve it for the Western world, when during the Renaissance they're retranslated from the Arabic back into Greek, into Latin, so that Europe can rediscover the wisdom it had forgotten of its own tradition. But they often get jumbled together. At one time, people thought that part of Aristotle belonged to Plato, and so it sort of confused the approach. In the end, it was all trying to harmonize philosophy, which clearly had a descriptive and analytic power to it, and the canons of revealed religion, and that's why the church preserved it. In Jewish thought, even though there are aspects of the Talmud that show an influence of philosophy, in general, Greek thought was rejected, and philosophy was not incorporated. And so it wasn't until the Arabic period where Jews began to have to grapple with this philosophical material again in the Arabic translation, because they're talking with their neighbors who are exposed to Greek philosophy through Arabic, and that they begin to do it again. So there really is a gap between Philo of Alexandria, who's working in the 1st century of the Common Era, and Saadia Gaon, who's living in the 9th century of the Common Era, who's really the next example of Jewish philosophy. And so there's a gap of 700 years where they're not involved in that conversation anymore, and it's the church that's really the one grappling more directly with